hear that okay? Disembodied voice.
They can just do it. Everybody introduce themselves.
Okay.
So Nancy has a chance to say, hello, I'm so here. And there's no time for that. They can just introduce themselves.
We good out there? Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming out to this March Legislative Cracker Barrel hosted by the Vermilion Area Chamber of Commerce and Development Center. Their Governmental Affairs League is in partnership with the League of Women Voters, the Clay County Republicans, and the Clay County Democrats. So I'm going to let our District 17 legislators introduce themselves, and then we'll do a little introductory and get on to your questions.
Okay, well, Nancy Rasmussen is still in Pier and didn't get here, but she's here telephonically, so she'll be able to hear your questions and answer them. I'm Senator Art Rush. I'm in my 5th year in the legislature, and it's been an interesting year, but we can talk about that, I guess, when we get to the narration part of this.
I'm Representative Ray Ring. I'm in my last term. And it has indeed been an interesting year, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk about it. I do want to mention that if we go, and you folks always make sure that we go for 2 hours. If we go, I'm going to sneak out about 10:45 because Berwin Svoboda's funeral is at 11 o'clock, and I wanted to go to that. So if we're still discussing, I'm not avoiding your questions. So that's good.
And we have Representative Nancy Rasmussen on the phone here, as I just said. Nancy, did you want to say anything?
I would. Thank you for letting me be a part of this event via telephone, and I'm real excited about hearing your questions and your thoughts. It has been an interesting session, and there have been some times when I feel like we have been on a roller coaster. So like Representative Ring, I am in my last term, and I'm ready for your questions.
Okay. So we'll get to your questions. Each of your legislators will have 5 minutes to respond to those questions. Keep an eye on the time in the back of the room, and when that red card comes up, we'll give you a couple of seconds to finish up your answer with something like, oops, my time is up, and then we can interrupt. And as you have questions, if you don't mind, just raise your hand and then stand up and state your name so that we know who you are, and then we can get to your question. So let's jump into it. What do you want to know?
Well, I'll maybe start out and talk a little bit here before give people a chance to get some questions. But so we're at, South Dakota legislature. We used to have a long term and a short term, but they're all the same now, 40 days or thereabout. And we always reserve a day for veto day at the end of March. But we've got 7 days left now to finish the main run of the legislative session. And a lot of that is going to be spent with budget determinations, because the Appropriations Committee has been working all session long on budget issues, but they finally are coming out to us with recommendations now, and we'll have to get action taken on that. And it's taken me several years to figure this. Ray was on appropriations at one time, so I'm sure he understands that. But we're really working on 2 different budgets. Our fiscal year 2019, which started July 1 last year and will finish up June 30th of this year, so we're 3/4 of the way through that. But we have to make adjustments, because these are all estimates. We have to make adjustments based on what the actual revenue and the actual expense expenses were. And then we're also making kind of a guesstimate budget for fiscal year 2020, which will start July 1 of this year and run the following year. So what happened, so when we're talking about the fiscal year 2019, we call that one-time money. And as far as for the budget for 2020, we talk about ongoing money on that. But for the one-time money is always lots of people coming in, lots of agencies coming in, the governor coming in with ideas about how they want that one-time money spent. And essentially what we're concluding now that we're three-quarters of the way through fiscal year 2019 is that we have $32 million extra. And that money came as I understand it, the revenue estimates were almost right on track, but the departments have spent less money than what was allocated for them. And so that's where the extra $32 million. And the two biggest areas on that are the fact that a big chunk of that comes from the Department of Social Services, that they just have no real way of knowing how much demand there's going to be for their services in the coming year. And so they probably always budget conservatively, which means they budget high, and so there's money left over. And the other is education, because they also kind of budget high because they don't know how many students are going to be. And when there are less students this year than they had anticipated, that results in extra money, because what the legislature authorizes so many dollars per student. So, and there's other sources for that $32 million too. But so we're starting to make decisions about that $32 million and what should be done with that. Probably the biggest single issue on that is they really feel that there's a desperate need for a medical facilities building at the prison in Sioux Falls, the Jameson Andex. So they're talking about $7.4 million for that. The governor also had an idea, because of the difficulties we're having with the nursing homes, that she wants to provide some innovation grants to nursing homes to allow them to experiment with some new ideas as far as staffing and care and see whether they can reduce their costs. And so we're appropriating $6 million for that. The governor wanted $1 million for pheasant habitat. It looks like at least we're talking about only $500,000 for that, but a limitation in there that cannot go for any pay-for-hunt facilities. It's got to be facilities that'll be open to the public. And then I was interested, the Senate anyway has approved a $400,000 appropriation for Palisade State Park, which is one of our smallest state parks in the state, and is close to Sioux Falls and is very heavily used. So if they can double the size of that park and provide some more facilities, I think that will provide quite a bit more. So anyway, that's just kind of an introduction. I did see Chelsea got her hand up there before I started talking, but.
My name is Chelsea Gilbertson. Hi, Nancy.
Hi.
I have a little blurb and then my question. So first and foremost, as a young South Dakotan, I would just like to say I fully acknowledge how lucky I am to have all of you as my representatives and senator. This has obviously been kind of a traumatic session, and the bills that we've killed is just amazing. Shout out to Representative Rasmussen. And so with that in mind,
Which bill are you talking about?
Sorry.
A lot.
I had an exchange with Representative Rasmussen about 1108, the anti-transgender student bill, and immense gratitude for Representative Rasmussen and obviously for Representative Ring for voting no on that bill. So that bill was awful, and it's dead now. So yeah, sorry. Woo. So with that in mind, we've seen within this session a lot of really concerning, what I would argue is anti-intellectual rhetoric. And I actually recently saw an article that said that South Dakota is one of the states that uses the fewest fiscal notes attached to bills, which is ironic because I feel we're a state very focused on how we work with our money. And then we've seen, you know, for example, on the funding pre-K education bill, certain comments calling pre-K education socialism, or that it would lead to socialism. Just a lot of really concerning, like I said, kind of anti-intellectual rhetoric, you know, reasoning bills based on no evidence. So and I recognize that this is something that has always been happening. So going forward in the future, how can we make it more desirable to incentivize legislators to use fiscal notes to attach to their bills, to reach out to constituents about the bills they're bringing before bringing it? What do we need? More constituent action? Do we need to catch the bills, you know, before they're introduced? What can we do as a state to kind of, because my frustration is that I hear, you know, I email legislators and I say, we've killed this bill 6 years in a row, stop bringing it. But their attitude is, well, I can bring whatever bill I want. Is that appropriate? Do we need to hold on to a tax on individualism? Do we need to allow, what space exists for non-evidence-based reasoning in the bills that we see introduced? Sorry, that was a lot. I apologize.
I'll let you answer that, Art.
Well, one of the things that South Dakota is different than Washington, D.C. or a lot of other states is that every bill gets a hearing. And even bills that have zero support or almost zero support gets a hearing, and the Argus Leader prints about it, even though it's got no support. And so I think it gets a lot of people upset, even though it's not going anywhere in the legislature. And I get a lot of emails from people that are very concerned about bills. And, you know, I talk around, and you look at the sponsors. And if you look at the sponsors, you can pretty well tell whether something's going to go somewhere or not. I'm sure Ray would agree with me on that, you know, if there are people that have no particularly respect in the legislature, their bills are not going to go anywhere. But we we don't, in Washington, D.C., a committee chairman can say, I don't like that bill, it's never going to see the light of day. And so we don't do that in Pierre. Every bill gets a hearing, and that involves some bills that probably aren't worth getting a hearing. But you know, we get through our bills in 40 days. And, you know, we hear a lot of nonsense sometimes, if I can describe it that way. You know, the fiscal notes, I've heard complaints this year, particularly, that there's concern about some of the legislators because they asked for fiscal notes early on about bills, and we just never got them. The LRC was too busy because we have a very small staff. And even when you get a fiscal note, you know, the ones I look at most are the prison impact statements, which are a form of fiscal notes. And they say, well, you know, we can't find anybody that's been convicted of this, so we're just going to assume nobody's going to get convicted of this, and therefore the fiscal impact of this is zero, which I'm not sure is really a good way of looking at that. But, you know, when you're trying to estimate what a bill is going to cost and what it's going to cost as far as incarceration, that's kind of a difficult thing. And you know, I can see why the LRC pushes those to the back of their desk when they're working on stuff. Anyway, Ray, or Nancy, I don't.
Yep.
You want to talk first, Nancy?
I would be open to answer that unless we want. Is that all right?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think it's important to remember that not every legislator brings a bill that is their bill. There are constituent bills, and some people will come up, and so that would be like any of you coming up to any of us saying, I would like you to sponsor this bill. And whether we agree with it or disagree, I think if it's against what we think our values are, or, you know, I think there's a certain determination. But mostly, if a constituent comes up and says, would you please try to move this issue, that's called a constituent bill. Now, sometimes a department, whether it's the, I've had the Secretary of State ask me to carry a bill, and so that would be a department bill. I was asked this year to carry a bill for a lobby group, and so that is a bill that I'm bringing forward, but it's not for me, it's for that particular group. And so I've never called to see what support there would be before I would write a bill, especially if it was a certain constituent asking me to bring it forward. But I have called with some bills that I am not sure of, because Clay County and Turner County have different dynamics. And so this is just one example. I called about years ago about Common Core and how people felt about Common Core. And so both of my son-in-laws are economists, and I've been told if I make this many phone calls, that is a good that will tell me that I could use those numbers to determine. So I have done some calling on other people's bills or bills that are controversial. So.
Okay, first of all, should we allow all legislators to bring whatever bills they want to? Yes, absolutely. As much as it drives me nuts when I listen to some bills that I think are really nutty, we do want an open process, and this is a way. I mean, it's a price we pay. It's a trade-off in making sure that everybody has a chance to be heard. I'm going to disagree with Nancy a little bit on the constituent bills. I agree that we need to bring constituent bills. I brought one this year. But to blame a lot of these bills as constituent bills, I think lets us off the hook. You're right, there are bills that come back every year. There are bills that have come back every year that we passed an Article 5 convention bill a few years ago that we shouldn't have passed. Fortunately, we may be able to repeal it, but why you need to keep bringing a bill to pass something that's already been passed is beyond my poor powers of comprehension. Fiscal notes, I don't think, solve a lot of problem, because they're just fiscal notes. If there was some kind of an analysis or explanation of what's in the bill, what's likely to happen, okay, but fiscal notes are estimates of the financial effect, and very often those are at best a wild guess. And that's not a criticism of the LRC by any means, because I've written fiscal notes.
Economists.
Pardon me?
That's a criticism of economists.
No, it's not a criticism of economists either. If you want to hear me criticize economists, there's one back there. Okay. When I was working in D.C., I wrote what we didn't call them fiscal notes, but they were close to that, and I can tell you that sometimes they weren't much more than wild guesses. If you don't have some kind of basis to base your estimate on, it's a guess. And I wrote a couple when I was in Illinois. In some cases, they're helpful, but in a lot of cases, and we had one this year, on what's the effect of changing the way that we levy the automobile excise tax. And it was pretty much a guess. There was really no way of knowing what the effect of that was going to be. And so I'm not sure that I think fiscal notes are that helpful. Do we let everybody? Yeah. How do you get a more intellectually informed discussion? Elect different legislators. Not here, of course, but but get some of those people, and I won't name names, replaced.
We've got Evelyn.
I have a question about I don't know, they're called vector bills, or they're empty bills, and this year they've been, my
Vehicle bills.
Oh, vehicle, there you go. I know began with a V and a V in it. And so-
Vacuous might be a good word.
Yeah. So what do you feel about those? And there's been so many this year. They're just sort of empty, waiting for something to happen. I mean, is that really a bill? Would that be considered a bill?
I guess this is one of those on the one hand and on the other hand issues, I think. Part of the reason that, and I would agree, we probably had too many vehicle bills this year. And whether, I'm not sure what the reason for that was, except maybe because we weren't sure what was coming from the governor because we didn't get her budget address until later and so forth. People were sort of protecting themselves. But the advantage of having a vehicle bill is that sometimes something comes up late in the session, either because of some kind of national change or just because of, in the process of discussing things, something comes up. And if we're past the deadline for submitting bills, then you can go in there and add a bill to that vehicle bill. The other thing that's often done is, and I did one Thursday, is what's called hog housing, where you delete everything after the enacting clause and put in a new bill. Sometimes that's necessary because of things that have come up, but it can be abused, and I think we had too many. Now, I actually, what's happened to some of those this year, in the tax committee, we had one session where we simply tabled either 3 or 4 of them over the course of about, I don't know, 20 minutes or a half hour, just in case we needed them later, but my guess is we'll never see them again because they'll just die at the end of the session. You want to?
You know, I think we're to the point where a lot of those vehicle bills that you're talking about are being killed because they concluded there really wasn't any need for it. The reason that there was probably more vehicle bills this year because people didn't know what the governor was going to want and didn't know what we would have to do to help her out. And also the budget, well, the budget doesn't meet the deadline, does it? But particularly, I think, you know, concerns about the budget and how money will be spent when we really don't have the information early on. You know, how can you put a dollar figure in early on when you don't know what the dollar is going to be? You know, probably some of that could be avoided if the public was willing to pay for big staffs for the legislators, so we could be working on that. But, you know, we have 0 staff other than our, you know, a few people in the LRC and some interns. And, you know, so it's legislators don't know what's coming up. And that's one of the reasons for the vehicle bills.
There was another question. Oh, no, sorry, Nancy, do you have something to add to that? Yes.
Yes, I agree with both individuals, but I would like to say that I know that there were a few people, like maybe 6 people, that I knew of that had something to put in that bill, but because of LRC staffing, their title was on the bill, but it wasn't filled in with all of the other information that they needed, so they were labeled vehicle bills.
Can I make one other comment?
Sure.
Senator Rush mentioned budgeting. What will sometimes happen there is that they'll amend a bill, and I had this happen to one of mine. They'll amend a bill down to $1. So we had a bill to take, I think it was $1 million out of the Ready Fund and put it into needs-based scholarships, which I've been advocating for a long time. And the Appropriations Committee amended it down to $1. But what they were doing was keeping that alive so that at some later point, after they have the final budget estimates and so forth, if there's money available, they may put some money back in there. And the last I heard, and I don't want to say too much here, but Senator Nessebar who's the sponsor on the other side, had heard that we might get $1 million into that fund, which would be wonderful, because one of the problems I've had with the needs-based scholarships is that they appropriate money but put it into a grant, or into a fund like we would with a private scholarship, and then only use the revenue from that, the earnings from that fund, like a foundation, which to me doesn't make any sense for the state government to do. But this time I was told that this might be $1 million for needs-based scholarships rather than going into that fund. So that's not a promise, it's just a rumor I've heard, but I think it would be a one-time thing, yeah.
Well, and the Dakota Promise scholarships for the need-based scholarships has been a high priority of the regents this year, and we've heard a lot of things. We heard at one point that there was a possibility of $1 million of the one-time funds for the Dakota Promise. Recently, we heard that the House was trying to put the kibosh on that, and as a compromise, that maybe we were going to be looking at $500,000 of ongoing funds, which really is a better deal than the $1 million in one-time funds. So, you know, that's kind of what we're hoping at this point, is $500,000 of ongoing funds.
Nancy, did you want to make any other additions?
No, I think I'm good.
And if there was a question back here?
Excuse me. My name is Liz Berrigan. I live in Union County, but I pay my taxes to the Vermillion School District, so I have an expanded funds for there. And I just wanted to make a comment on when you talk about any bill that is introduced gets a light. Sometimes it seems that that's a light that it does not deserve. When you are talking about the bills in South Dakota, I'm often reminded of a certain point by Emily Dickinson that said, the word is dead when it is said, some say. I say it just begins to live that day. And what seems to continually live in South Dakota is an endless fascination for expanding guns, discriminating against transgender individuals, and a concerted effort to tell teachers what they can teach and how they should be teaching it. And when you tell teachers that they could discuss gender dysphoria in elementary schools or middle school, social studies teachers could only teach certain things in a certain way, it is simply not in any way a productive way for citizens to be involved in the legislation. And I know it's difficult for our representatives and senators to deal with this, but I would hope somewhere along the line somebody could say, as you have said, okay, guns on campus, we've done it 8 times, stop it. Stop trying to tell teachers how they can teach and what they can teach, and stop spending endless hours on what kind of a bathroom a transgender individual should use or not use. And if anybody wants to follow up on the whole concept of transgender individuals, I would suggest you read a book called Becoming Nicole by Amy Ellis Nutt, and it would seriously, I think, and permanently expand one's empathy and understanding for the process of transgendering. So I would just make it, again, my comment is there are so many issues that it's just in my opinion that do not deserve to live in a legislative session. I would hope that somewhere along the line there will be some sort of a happy medium of all that.
Well, my response to that is, you know, I agree with you. There's a lot of bills that I think are completely worthless, but when you appoint somebody as a dictator who gets to decide what bills can be heard and what bills don't, that's subject to abuse, and that's what we see in Washington, D.C.
But isn't that always the response, Art? I mean, that's always the response of, oh, you can't have someone saying what we should do and what we should do. But
Well, I mean, what if the person who's deciding that is somebody you don't agree with? You know, that's...
As a legislator, if I bring to you and say, I want you to expand the concept of white supremacy and white nationalism in South Dakota, would you introduce that as a bill?
Well, I wouldn't introduce it, but there are some people who would. You know.
What's that? Yeah,
Well,
That's my answer again, is, you know, I agree that we waste a lot of time on a lot of bills. The good news is, thank God for the Senate. Well, actually, for the floor of the House, we've killed some of the bills that came out of the Education Committee, and the ones that we didn't kill, the Senate did, either in committee or on the floor. But, you know, and again, it's a trade-off. If you're going to let anybody, if you're going to have a real democracy and let even representative democracy and let anybody who wants to introduce a bill, then you're going to get some that we think are useless. And the thing to do is to get some of those people out of the legislature. Because, you know, I've written in my columns about the attack on public education this term, or this session. And I had made a list yesterday of some of the more important bills that I thought might come up, and just now I went down and checked all those that looked like report on attack on education, and it's more than half of them. Fortunately, again, most of them have died. I've spoken against them. The Education Committee this year is amazing. Fortunately, between the House and the Senate, the House floor and the Senate, we've killed some of the worst stuff.
You know, and I have bills that I think are important, and there's obviously, you know, my chemical trespass bill, my no death penalty for severely mentally ill people, that there's a majority who thinks that my bills are worthless, so, because they defeated them, but that doesn't change my mind that those are important issues that we need to address.
Nancy, do you have a comment?
Well, yes, I do, and I didn't get to hear all of the comments of the speaker, but I think I picked up the general idea. I'd like to put just a historical perspective on bills, and if 100+ years ago people did not fight for the right for a woman to vote, we wouldn't be voting now. I think they've fought that for a long time, and so there were many people who thought that it was a bad idea, plus a lot of inappropriate words, for a woman to vote. And the suffragettes took a lot of criticism and abuse. And so I'm really pleased that today, all of those years later, that those people kept bringing a bill and bringing a bill, because today we do have the right to vote. And it's not just the woman vote, but there are other issues. A friend of mine passed a bill a year ago that they worked 25 years to pass. And so even though some of the bills we do not like, those that are bad at the time, we have the right to vote no.
I would just say that the discussion about endless hours, you know, most of these bad bills, assuming they get killed in their initial committee, maybe hear half an hour of testimony in the committee, and then if the committee agrees that it's a terrible bill, it gets killed. So it isn't endless hours that get spent on these bills, despite what you might read in the Argus Leader.
All right, we've got a few questions. I'm going to try to remember the order that I've seen the hands go up, but there was one here.
Mine's super easy, and I apologize because this probably would have added some clarity. Is there a way that we as constituents can know about bills before they're all dropped on that one day? Like, basically, is there a way we can say, oh, there's a bill that's awful, we should reach out to the sponsor and try and convince them to withdraw it before it's even dropped? I'm not familiar. Is that something that can be done?
I don't think so either. In fact, the Legislative Research Council, which is our administrative arm for the legislature, is obligated to maintain secrecy on the bills that they're asked to prepare for legislators, so that their opponents don't get advance notice of it and do exactly what you would talk about there. But, you know, once the bills are dropped, of course, it's on the LRC website, and anybody can look at those and can see the history of what's gone on. But before they drop them, I don't know that there's a way of doing that.
And they do make, and I've seen more of this year than in the past, I think. That's really an attempt to made if somebody's going to bring an amendment, particularly a hog house where they completely change the bill. They will bring the amendment and then defer consideration for at least a couple days or over a weekend, so that, and you know, they'll say the reason we're doing this is so that people can go out and look at that online and see what it is, so they can at least provide some input before or during the discussion of the bill when we consider it in committee. Now, you practically have to be a lobbyist in order to know where to look for those particular bills, but if you're interested enough, you can probably pick that up.
You know, as a practical matter, if a legislator, whether a House member or another senator, is going to try to amend my bill, they will generally come and talk with me, tell me what they're going to do, see if they can persuade me to agree that that will be a friendly amendment as opposed to one that I'll oppose. And, you know, sometimes their amendments make the bill better and sometimes they don't. You know, having said that, though, we see some things, you know, I'm sure a lot of you were aware of the guns on campus issue this year, and that got defeated. And then, but how many of you were aware that they tried to bring that back again last week with a hog house, and the committee didn't even see the hog house and were misled by the sponsor about that, what it would do. And some of the committee members who had voted for the hog house bill contacted me that weekend and said, you know, we got to kill this thing because it was bad, and even though we voted for it, and fortunately we were able to kill the second effort by a much larger margin than we did the first effort. But, you know, that's probably more rare that kind of underhanded thing goes on. But
Nancy, do you want to jump in?
I was listening so closely to what Senator Rush was saying. I'm just, no, I'm sorry. I was just listening too close. So.
I think there was a question right back here. Okay. Over on this side.
Okay. I know we've been talking a lot about the goofy legislation that seems to be introduced every session, and especially this session, but can we flip that question around a little bit and talk about maybe some good legislation that is receiving or has received rather strange responses? For example, legislation that would enhance early childhood education in South Dakota. My understanding is it died in committee. I believe it may have been the Speaker of the House or other leading legislator stated that it would instill socialism in our kids. I believe a woman testified that enhancing early childhood education would somehow enhance transgenderism in our young children. Are there any other decent bills that might be at risk from just goofy legislators and people?
Well,
I'm going to jump in and let Nancy start for a second. It's hard when you don't see somebody sitting here.
Okay, could you just repeat that question? I mean, that was like a comment and a question. Do I understand that I'm being asked what bills do I think were good bills? Or am I being asked just about the early childhood learning piece?
Well, we can start with that. Is there any chance that the legislation to enhance early childhood education could be brought back, perhaps in a different form? My understanding is it died in committee.
Correct, it did. I don't know that that would come back this year, but I think that that's going to come back every year. I think this is a bill that will be seen every year.
Well,
I'll mention another that I think was a good bill and that seemed to be supported from all sides, and that was the bill to administer the driver's license test in Spanish. And the Sioux Falls Chamber of Commerce supported it, the South Dakota Chamber of Commerce supported it, the Democrats all supported it, and it died in committee, I think. I don't think I put that one on here. What the justification was, I don't know. I just know that it had progressed. I think, did the Senate pass it? That was Nesseba's bill.
Yeah, I think we passed it.
Yeah, so it must have died in the House committee. That's an example. The early Learning Advisory Council, which I think that's what you're talking about. You're right, it was going to lead to socialism. That's nothing new. I remember Gene Mahan complaining that when people talked about preschool education, and when would that have been? 40 years, not quite 40 years ago. When people talked about early childhood education, the concern was that this was going to indoctrinate the kids, and they should be left with their parents, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think that's another good one that we've pushed for years and years, and you know, yes, it would cost some money, although an early learning advisory council isn't going to cost all that much, and there have been some proposals. I think they're there again this year for a pilot project, or to, you know, there are a number of districts in the state, including ours, I believe, that already provide a certain amount of pre-K education, and there could be some experiments, some studies after the fact to see how effective those are. Studies around the country show that it's great for economic development, it's great for success of the kids, but there is that kind of opposition that is I don't understand it.
Could I make a comment here?
Go ahead.
I am very much in support of early childhood learning. I opened up a preschool in my home 2 days a week before some 20-some years ago, when my youngest was a baby, because there were people who wanted socialization for their children, but could not get into any other program in my area. And so I just opened a preschool myself, and I was surprised. 2 people drove 14 miles one way, and they shared the driving so their daughters could attend my preschool, which was just 2 mornings. It was 8:30 to 11:30, and it was a delightful time. My son should have been the smartest kindergartner in his class, but he was not. But it was, and even the years, I changed my program every year. I added writing the last year that I had preschool, because kids are just seem to be a little bit smarter today. So I'm very much in favor for it, and I had a delightful time doing it.
So, you know, I have a couple of bills this year. some of them have been defeated and some of them are still alive, and the stories that I heard in opposition to them are just unbelievable. The no death penalty for mentally ill was, for severely mentally ill, was one of them. I mean, we had horror stories from this year and last year about, and from other legislators about nobody will ever be executed because everybody who commits crimes is severely mentally ill, which is simply not true. And the same thing with my bill, which is still alive, about transparency, no secret lawsuit settlements by governmental entities. And the insurance industry, every case will have to go to trial, or it won't ever be able to settle any lawsuits. And, I think we've diffused that on that one. But, you hear these arguments in respect to many bills, and some of them, just from my knowledge and experience, I can just tell you they're nonsense. But I guess that, it's a bill that kind of came up again this year, but this goes back to the first year, and it was one that requires school counselors to disclose to parents anything that their student told them, which I heard from school counselors from all over the state that was a really bad idea. And because kids aren't going to talk to the counselor about their problems. And so when we were in committee, had a woman who was a school counselor from the Black Hills area who came up and testified in favor of this bill. And so we have a questioning period, and I asked her, I said, well, why are you testifying in favor of this when I've heard from all these other school counselors from all over that this is a bad idea? And her answer was, oh, I don't know, I haven't read the bill. Which,
Bet I know who that was. She testifies on everything.
Yes.
I'm wondering, from each of you, if you think the Legislative Research Council is sufficiently funded and staffed, is it able to process, there was 460 bills this session?
well, it's hard to say. During the session, which is 40 days, I mean, they're terribly busy. I'm not sure how busy they are the rest of the year. So I don't know whether you can really afford to expand a lot of staff that and certainly bills can be pre-filed and they work on other issues during the time, but because of the short session, I'm not sure that it's really practical to try to expand their staff a lot more.
I guess I'm asking, do you think they have enough during the session?
Oh, clearly not. I've heard, and more so this year than other years, that people just couldn't get their bills back, that they couldn't get their fiscal notes back.
Yeah, every year during the session, they bring in people to assist with the committee hearings and that sort of thing. But I'd say particularly the regular staff, I agree, is just, they do a fantastic job. Some of us went in and dropped a bill on a guy about 6 o'clock the other night, and he said he'd try to have it ready by about 8. It was there the next morning. They do a fantastic job, but I think, but they clearly are overstretched, particularly during the session. Other times they're writing issue memos and that sort of thing and doing research. But it's a real problem because there's the demand for about 2.5 months, and then what do you do with those people the rest of the time?
Representative Rasmussen, did you want to?
Yes, I think we need more staff, and I think that this year we had a turnover. We had new people come, and I'm not sure, but I thought I heard somebody say they were short one. Now, I'm not sure if that is true or not, but I think we had new staff, and it takes a while to settle in, which was too bad.
Okay, just a reminder that when you're asking a question, please state your name ahead of time, too.
Okay.
On what? Oh.
I voted against that, but it's a much better bill. I think that's the second one, capital carry bill, that came up this year, and it's a much better bill than the first one. My recollection is that it requires, first of all, I don't know whether you know, but there are different levels of permits that you have to have, or you can have, to carry a concealed pistol. One of them is just a general permit, one is the enhanced permit, and one is the gold card permit. But the enhanced permit requires training and some other accuracy, range work. And so this is limited to people with enhanced permits. And secondly, that it requires that somebody who's going to carry a gun into the Capitol with an enhanced permit has to give 48 hours notice to the Highway Patrol that guards the Capitol. So, you know, I don't like to see guns at all in the Capitol, but with only enhanced permit carriers and 48 hours notice, it was at least palatable, but I still voted against it. But
Representative Rasmussen?
Sorry, I had 2 calls and a text all at the same time. Could you repeat Jack's question again? My phone is making noises as all of these things are coming.
Nancy, it had to do with 115, which is a capital carry bill, which I think has passed the Senate but has not been on the floor of the House yet.
Are you asking if I like that or not? Oh, after crossover day, I think it was good that we didn't have guns in the Capitol. Capital carry. So
I'm against it.
I think that's something that's brought every year, but I don't know that that will be something I will support.
One of these days it's going to pass.
Well, affairs will be before.
Yeah. Well, state affairs is a different committee.
My main concern is who dictates who can and who can't. Hard to explain. But who is it? The state patrol then that says yes or no?
Well, they can't say yes or no. If the person has an enhanced permit and they give the 48 hours notice, then they can carry. There isn't anybody that says yes or no.
Okay, thank you.
But I think you do need, there's quite a bit of screening to get the enhanced carry, is there not?
Right,
Plus training.
right, yeah.
Yeah. So he's right. It's better than just a carte blanche sort of, you can bring a gun into the Capitol anytime you want to. That doesn't mean I approve of it, but it just means that, you know.
I mean, we had that earlier in the session about anybody can carry a gun in anytime for any reason or for no reason. Well, now it's in the governor's office, but the prior one allowed anywhere.
There's, right up.
Change pace for you, Nick Oyen, you know, wear many hats around the man. Make an easy question for you. How's the Medicaid funding going?
Okay. We've been talking about that in caucus. In fact, we're going to meet again Sunday night and start going over that. You know, and what we're talking about in caucus is that the Senate would like to see a 2.5% increase. You know, I heard that the House is resisting that they're looking at 2.3, but either 2.3 or 2.5 is better than what you've got in the last couple of years. So I don't know how that's going to come out. But
Our Assistant Minority Leader, Steve McCleary, has his own bill and has been pushing very hard for that, at least for some one-time money. I believe it was his bill, called for appropriating $8 million from the general fund, and then that would match to about $11 million in federal funds. It was just for one time. House appropriations killed it 1 to 8. and you know who that one is. It's the one Democrat who's on House Appropriations. So I'm not sure. Something I think is still alive. Art seems to be more current on at least what's going on in the Senate. We're hearing enough. There's enough pressure that I think something will be done, but that doesn't mean it'll be enough. It hasn't been in any of the years that I've been in the legislature, and it's just another example of what we live with because of a shortage of resources, because we aren't willing to raise the funds that we need for early childhood education, for community service providers, for nursing homes, for, I can go on and on.
So, if I can get a clarification. So if I understand correctly, Governor Nome originally proposed a 2.5% increase coming effective April 1st, and a follow-up 2% increase coming effective with the fiscal year. So when you're mentioning 2.3 potentially, is that even the one, I'm getting nervous now that what's being discussed, we're getting asked by some of the top levels of even the Republican Party in appropriations, tell us what's your full number. Give us a fully included number that solves all your problems. And we're providing that. And we've provided that number. And you know, it's somewhere in the ballpark of $8 million annually to even get us close. And they ask for that, and they say thank you for that, and they ask for, okay, what's the number for taking care of kids, and we provided that, and they're saying thank you for that. So now I've gotten real nervous that what I've heard from you, Senator Rush, is, boy, the 2.5% that Governor Nome is asking for is even in jeopardy, let alone what is behind the scenes being asked for.
One of the things that I'm hearing, and again, I'm not on Appropriations Committee, so I'm not part of these discussions, but the community support providers in the nursing homes have always been kind of treated under the same treatment, and that there's going to be a move to try and separate that. Whether that helps you or hurts you, I don't know.
Well, it's up to the appropriators if they separate that.
Yeah. You know, the number, I've got notes here that they were talking about $19 million for a Medicaid expansion. What that converts to as far as a percentage, I don't know, and whether that's realistic that that's what'll come out, I don't know either.
Representative Rasmussen?
Well, I would like to comment on this. I hope I'm not going off on a tangent, but this has concerned me and makes me angry about nursing homes. We have cited many years that we are in a crisis, and rather than handle or address the crisis every year, we have put monies into something else. We paid down bonds because paying down bonds were more important than giving to nursing homes and the CSPs. And so I've watched, and I feel so bad for McCleary because I've got several nursing homes yet in my district. I think Viber will be okay, but I don't know about the other one. Centerville had quite a hard time. This has just been ignored. And I think it's interesting because I went to a meeting in the fall, and then I saw all of these new buildings that have been built, big fancy facilities in Sioux Falls, and I'm thinking, why don't we keep the nursing homes open in our small areas rather than, you know, if they don't have any money, why are they building something new? So I think there's something going on that we're not hearing about. And it was the understanding, you know, as Art said, you know, some of the things he's been hearing. What I've been hearing over the last couple of years is, okay, this year we as a legislature are going to focus on this. next year we're going to do nursing homes and CSPs, and that next year never comes. And I don't understand if there's a bigger plan that nobody's letting us know about. And I think that expansion of Medicaid has just been, you know, it's now expansion of services, which I think is needed. But I just feel really sad that I think some of the pickle we find ourselves in is from choices in the past. And
Well,
I think it's a crisis.
There's kind of an explanation about why you're seeing nursing homes in Sioux Falls and you're not seeing them in the little communities. And, you know, here in District 17, we had the nursing home in Parker closed. And, you know, I've certainly heard from the nursing home in Marion and Irene, Wakanda, that the difficulties that they're having. But the Medicaid only doesn't pay the full cost of keeping somebody in a nursing home, and they're short $40 or $50 a day. So if you're in a nursing, if you've got a nursing home that has a fair mixture of Medicaid and private pay people, they can up the price on the private pay people in order to take care of that shortfall. If you have a nursing home that's 70, 80% Medicaid, you just flat can't raise the price enough on the private pay people to make up that difference. So that's what the difference is. And, you know, particularly you get to some of the small nursing homes around the state, they're the ones that have the more likelihood of having, you know, 70 or 80% Medicaid patients in there and not enough private pay. So that's why we're seeing the problems with the small homes and not seeing the problems in Sioux Falls.
So you're thinking that the bigger nursing homes in Sioux Falls are going to have more patients that are able to do the full pay?
That's my understanding.
No comment.
John, I just had a question for Ray. Expand a little bit on the rationale as to why the bill on driver's licenses in Spanish was defeated. A business owner who supported that wanted me to ask you, as a representative, what was the rationale for that?
You know, I got to plead ignorance. That happened in committee. It didn't come to the floor. And so it wasn't one that I was paying a lot of attention to. I sort of assumed that, particularly since it went right through the Senate, I sort of assumed that it would, and had all this support from the business community, from Sioux Falls. I assumed that it would,
and I wasn't there.
Right through, and so I didn't pay much attention to it.
I wasn't there, but the article that I read in the paper indicated to me that there were a number of legislators from South Sioux Falls who said, we don't know anybody who speaks Spanish or anybody who needs people who speak Spanish. And the legislators from North Sioux Falls said, you know, we have lots of constituents that need this, but South Sioux Falls is different than North Sioux Falls.
And I think that's the one that our speaker said we didn't want to be diluting our culture. Which I'll just leave that at that.
We know how many different cultures reside in Sioux Falls at present. Is it like 180 or something like that?
But the point is, there are a lot of Spanish speakers, and they're very involved in the community, and they need to be able to take and pass the driver's license test without being forced to bring in a translator or whatever.
But my question is, do we know how many other cultures are in Sioux Falls? My question is, leading into another question of, are there other large populations, so we would offer it not only in Spanish, but other languages as well?
I don't know how many there are, and I don't think it's relevant.
Well, I've heard that there's 180 other languages that are spoken by people in the Sioux Falls school system, but I don't know that any of those are a large enough population that there's any kind of a movement to try and change this for them as well.
Okay, thank you.
There was,
Yes, I'm Catherine Prattle. I actually live in Yankton, but I'm from the League of Women Voters, which is the organization formed from the suffragettes. And in the Argus Leader, or the P&D, I believe, this morning, there was an article about there's groups of people that are incentivizing people to come and register as citizens of South Dakota and the enticement is we have very low taxes on our vehicles, we have no income tax. So they go out to the Buffalo Chip campground or some small town and they have no permanent residence and they become a citizen of South Dakota. And the incentive for the state of South Dakota is apparently we're getting a lot of revenue from these people registering their vehicles and such. And then they get a mailbox business. So they have no permanent residence. Some of them have never maybe even lived in South Dakota or been to South Dakota. And the problem is that that allows them to vote in South Dakota. And we have apparently some loose language in the voter registration regulations. Of course, the League of Women Voters is part of our purpose is to ensure that we have integrity in our voting system, and also that we're registering people that are actually citizens of our state. And when we do this, now we're allowing these people to sway our elections. And so is there any thought of tightening up these loopholes in the voter registration laws that allow these people to vote when they don't really live in our state at all?
I'll talk about that. You know, we had this issue of residency came up in respect to several of the legislators because people were claiming they were really not residents. I've handled many lawsuits involving issues of residency, and the law is awfully clear that residency is a question of intent. So, you know, even if somebody, the fact that they go to Texas for the winter and have a post office box and that down there, they don't lose their South Dakota residency. Now, having said that, I'm very familiar with some of these mailbox. We have several here in eastern South Dakota where they incentivize people, you know, you come and you pay your monthly fee, they get your mail there, they forward your mail on to you. I've talked to some of my friends who have actually retired and travel instead of going to Pierre, who say they go to campgrounds and they walk around and see the number of South Dakota license plates, and they talk to people there, and the people say, oh, I've never been there, you know, or maybe they were just there in order to sign up for that. But, you know, it's a business. For me as a judge, it was particularly a problem because when we call these people for jury duty, which they're supposed to do, you know, none of them ever showed up for jury duty. And but yet, you know, if they don't have another permanent residence and they've determined to declare South Dakota their residence, you know, and I haven't seen any numbers that the numbers are getting so large that they actually can affect our elections. But you know, I could be persuaded otherwise on that too.
In a small county, you certainly could sway.
Yeah. Well, and Hanson County is the one where I'm familiar with here, where there's a big, Emory is a huge number of people there, and whether they're affecting the election there in Hanson County, I don't know. It's a legitimate concern, but on the other hand,
Can we tighten up that language?
you know, if they claim, you know, I don't have any other home and I'm just in my RV all the time, but my intent is to make South Dakota my home and pay my motor vehicle registration there, it's a little tough to know exactly how to draft language that would make that tougher.
I'll go along with Senator Rush on that one, and he knows this issue much better than I. I've heard that this is happening. I have really no idea. I don't know if anybody knows the extent of that.
Representative Rasmussen, did you have?
I would concur with the last two speakers.
They don't have to maybe have residency without registering to vote.
They can.
So is there any correlation between all these people registering in South Dakota and whether or not they actually registered to vote?
So, you know, if they're claiming South Dakota as their residence, then they probably would have trouble registering to vote somewhere else. But, yeah.
We had a question over here.
Well, I'm Tom Jones. I just had a question from a few years ago, and I'm trying to recall a little bit. When I was on appropriations, we talked several times and listened to different departments on their revenues. But there was one department that always kind of puzzled me because there was a $20 million carryover each year that was never used. And I could never understand why the appropriations would let that stay in that thing and be part of the budget, and it just carried over from year to year. And it seems like there's $20 million is quite a bit of money to me, and I don't know, Ray, if you remember that being in that one of those departments that was picking on the department.
Well, I will.
This doesn't make sense.
I don't know how to answer that without picking on the department. Was that I think it's Medicaid appropriation where they had, I think it was a $20 million sort of contingency fund to. Okay, yeah, that's, well, that would be Medicaid. I think what they did, you're right, they had this contingency fund, and then they began to make the forecast to be sure that the forecasts were high, but they still kept the $20 million contingency fund. I think they finally did away with the contingency fund, but they've continued, and we'll see what happens this year, and I haven't had a chance to really look at it. They've continued to overestimate, I think it's Medicaid, and that was the main factor for the fact that we always end up with a surplus at the end of the fiscal year. Part of it was underestimating revenues, the other was overestimating spending, and that was, I believe, the particular place that they were doing that. Now, there was something in the governor's budget address about, I'm hoping it means that they're maybe going to try to forecast that part of the budget more accurately. I'm not going to count on it yet, but maybe that will, maybe that'll change. That's the best I can say.
And Tom, I think you're absolutely right. The 32 million overage from last year, the biggest share of that was Department of Social Services. And, you know, we've talked with them about that, with the new secretary in Committee on Health and Human Services, and he assured us that they're going to try and do a better job, but he also said, you know, that they just don't know how many people are going to need welfare and how many people are going to need Medicaid coverage in the coming year. And, you know, at least that was part of his explanation on that.
To follow up, please. To review that a little bit, if it's the same amount of money each year, at some point in time, you got to kind of figure out maybe that is a number that is consistent.
It's called rational expectations, right, Jerry? If you continually overestimate something, you adjust your estimating procedure, and they don't seem to be willing to do that. I'm hoping that with the new governor, maybe that'll change. But as I said, I'm not counting on it. 32 million. Well, it wasn't all. The whole $32 million wasn't because of Health and Human Services. I realize that, or Social Services.
That was the biggest share.
But that was the biggest share of it, and particularly when you've got a budgeted 10% surplus, there's no reason that you should continuously come in that much over or under estimate. You can do better than that, And if there's a year when you happen to have overestimated, you adjust the next year rather than continually creating this one-time money for the governor's pet projects.
Representative Rasmussen, did you want to jump in?
I am not on appropriations, and I only heard a portion of the comment from Mr. Jones, so I think I'm okay.
There was, did you have a question?
Well, actually, I was going to comment on why they had a problem with the Spanish language. In that I heard on television this guy, this quote, the Speaker of the House, saying he did not want our culture diluted by having people speak Spanish and other languages too, I'm sure. And I mean, I'm sure the legislature does wonderful things, and I think probably they should do something to let people know, but it's just appalling to know what goes on out there, or to hear what goes on out there. And it's frustrating to know what to do about it. I mean, we have friends who live in other states who, you know, it'd be nice if we could have something to tell them that we're pleading, as opposed to the poor elementary education, primary education, preschool, anything. It would be fun to be a leader in the right direction.
Could somebody repeat that for me?
Well, I'll weigh in on Nancy, and then,
Okay.
you know, I look around here, and I would never expect everybody in this room to have the same attitude and feelings about issues, and to expect that 105 legislators are going to have the same ideas. Now, you know, I agree that forbidding our driver's license examining from being in Spanish is foolish, and that thinking that we need to be all, you know, uniform in exactly how we think and exactly how we speak is ridiculous. But to get 105 legislators or everybody in this room to agree on one particular topic is simply impossible.
I don't think that's what I was advocating.
Yeah.
Or lamenting. But you'd like to have the majority of them positive.
So Nancy, I don't know whether that...
What was it that was appalling? I heard the word appalling, but I didn't hear what
Spanish, the not allowing Spanish driver's license tests.
The comment was the problem, that we don't want our culture diluted. That's almost racist, I think.
Just to follow up, to answer your question, I know there was another, I believe Representative Kevin Jensen, I had an email exchange with him, and he basically, and I'm kind of putting words into his mouth because I don't agree with him, but he basically said that those individuals can get a translator anyway, and so then I was like, well, like, you're expecting them to find their time, money, yeah, basically it's to assert my own opinion, and in his opinion, he didn't care enough to worry about how they were going to get that access. So that was kind of that answer, but I do have an actual question.
Did we have another comment on this, or? Okay. We've got this, and then you're next.
So on a happier note, something South Dakota is doing right, potentially, I'm really curious what you think will happen with the industrial hemp bill. My question is I don't know where the money's going, so if you could kind of summarize that, and then if you think the politics of Governor Noem's attitude toward the bill will get in the way and cause a veto. Basically what you expect with that bill to happen.
Well,
I would answer,
go ahead, Nancy.
Well, I would like to answer this because I was in committee on Thursday. This is just a really interesting bill. And in the beginning of when we were giving introductions, I said, sometimes I feel like I'm on a roller coaster. This would be a good bill to compare as a roller coaster, because in the beginning it seemed like this had a green light and that it was just smooth sailing, and somehow, somewhere, all of a sudden, I went into the meeting on Thursday believing that it was going to fail and felt very sad about that, but it passed. The 7-2 or 7-to whatever. So I was surprised that it passed out. Now, I don't know what's going to happen to it once it gets to the floor, but it was my understanding, whether it's correct or incorrect, that Governor Noem was in support of this bill. So sometimes me, and I would think we as legislators think that it's a smooth sail and something happens, but we don't really get to know a definite what the problem was. So if I'm not mistaken, I think it'll come down to whether or not Governor Noem signs the bill or not. Just my comments, just my thoughts. And I've been there. We have had hemp bill introductions for many years, and every year it's brought up, there was a sense of this isn't going to go anywhere. But this year it was just a total different atmosphere. It seemed like this was just going to, be one of those, go through all of the hoops and be signed. But I would encourage everybody to listen to what happened on Thursday online.
The difference this year is that the Farm Act, the federal government's Farm Act, which Governor Noem voted for, legalized industrial hemp for the first time in decades, I think, so that we can now more legitimately produce hemp, sell hemp, subject to some pretty stringent requirements that will be set up by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The bill that I think Nancy's referring to, 1191, was in Senate Agriculture and Natural Resources, I don't know what day. And what that would do is basically legalize the production of hemp. This bill, I believe this is the one that's prime sponsored by Orrin Lesmeister, who's a West River rancher, who seems to be an absolute expert on the whole thing. He says that he can go out into a field and tell you the difference between industrial hemp and the stuff that makes you high. The governor seems to think that they look the same, and so legalizing this is going to make us all a bunch of potheads, I guess. But it passed 68-2 or something like that in the House. It passed the Senate, if this is the bill Nancy's talking about, it passed the Senate 7-2, Senate Agriculture Committee. And we'll come to the Senate now. I'd be surprised if it doesn't pass pretty handily, because we passed it in the Senate, I guess it was 65-2. We passed it in the House even after she had expressed her reservations. So I think Nancy's right. It's going to come down to a matter of whether the governor vetoes it, and then whether, if she vetoes it, whether the legislature will override the veto.
It's a permissive bill then? That's all.
There are actually companies in South Dakota, processing companies, who want to see this happen because they can, we're all big on value added. They can take the hemp and turn it into various kinds of medical products, I think, that could be very beneficial to South Dakota. So I voted for it. I think it's a great idea, and I hope it passes.
Well, I just start out to say, I'm absolutely opposed to recreational marijuana. I don't think that the public is hearing nearly the problems that that's creating in places such as Colorado. I did vote for the use of the CBD oil for child epilepsy things because I think it maybe does have some medical uses. I'm really torn between on this industrial hemp. I know the opponents of it and the governor are saying that this is just going to be the first step towards opening up for legalizing marijuana, which I would be opposed to. On the other hand, I've heard from the proponents that there's some really valuable economic returns that can produce for our agricultural producers. I've read some of the articles that the governor's office has handed out, and certainly from those articles that I read, growing industrial hemp is a lot harder than people think. And that they indicated the number of people who really had lost their shirts trying to get into the industrial hemp business. One of them being that you know, if you grow a field and it turns out it's got over the 0.3 or 0.2.3 or whatever tetrahydrocannabinol, your whole crop gets destroyed. So, you know, and I don't think you can buy crop insurance that would protect you from that. So, you know, the material I read is that it isn't nearly the panacea that a lot of the proponents think that it might be. You know, on the other hand, if people want to try that and they can avoid the high THC marijuana, I guess I don't see any great harm in that either.
I just Googled industrial hemp, and it's legal in 33 states. Have you gotten any input from people from those other states about this issue? It would seem that, I mean, if more than half of the states have legalized it, it would seem that there is maybe some merit to it, wouldn't you think?
Because it's just permissive, right? It's just saying people can do it if they want. It's not saying like, the state's gonna do it and we're gonna make money. It's just permissive language, right?
Not saying you've got to raise.
Yeah.
Has there been a fiscal note on that?
Pardon?
Fiscal note on our cost. There's an article in the Argus today.
Okay, and I haven't seen that.
All right. So you had a question?
I just want to go back to the mailbox situation. Susan Odson was the name. I have a friend who works at one of them in Sioux Falls. I don't know how many there are in Sioux Falls, but she works in an office that has 5 full-time employees and a supervisor, and all they do all day long is process license renewals for RVers. Every day, her superintendent or her supervisor takes a stack of license renewals down to the Minnehaha County Courthouse and has those license renewals renewed for these people. I don't know how many clients they have, but just think about 6 full-time employees who do nothing else other than help people pretend to live in South Dakota. So, that was my
Okay. You had a question?
I had a question about SB 147, so the chemical trash plan. So it's the second year that it's gone up. I mean, it's caused harm to people within our county. Why does the legislature, why does it never pass?
Well, you know, this is the second year I brought the chemical trespass bill. Last year we tried to be more expansive as far as setting boundaries to keep people back away. That we heard from all the sprayers that they couldn't do that wouldn't work. So this year the bill was very minor. All it did is require chemical applicators to have insurance. I mean, you know, you got to have insurance to drive a car. Why wouldn't you have to have insurance to spray dangerous chemicals around? There really was not the extent of opponents from sprayers this year. The big problem was the Department of Agriculture, and you know, I thought the Senate Ag Committee made it clear to them last year that they needed to do something. You know, I contacted them early in the fall and said, what have you done? And, oh, we did this and this and this, none of which amounted to anything. And so then they called me and wanted to know if they could come down and meet with me about what I was proposing. And so a whole plane full of them flew down here to Vermilion, and I met with them, I think in November, December, about what I was proposing. And so I said, well, what are you proposing? Well, we don't know because we don't have a Secretary of Agriculture now. We're waiting for the new Secretary of Agriculture. So I never heard anything from them until 2 days before my bill was up for hearing, and then they came over and said, well, we're going to oppose it. And I said, why are you going to oppose it? Well, because we don't think it's in the right form. Well, what do you want? Well, we haven't done that yet. So they, you know, I guess I don't know whether anybody's listened to the committee hearing online, but I thought the Department of Agriculture got about as much of a ass chewing as anybody can get by a legislative committee because of the fact that they haven't done anything. So since then, I've emailed them and said, well, you know, I think the Senate Ag made it pretty clear that they want you to do something. What are you proposing to do? And they haven't answered my email. So I don't, you know, what's their reason for it? You know, I understand that they have a new secretary who maybe doesn't have her feet on the ground yet, but my sense from dealing with the pesticide people is that they're bureaucrats who just don't want to have to change anything from what they've been doing.
Back to the industrial hemp, more of a comment and maybe a question too. Being an agricultural state, I'm surprised that anybody would think that trying to hide recreational marijuana inside of industrial hemp field is just ridiculous because of cross-pollination would basically destroy the value of the high THC plants, while at the same time adding to the THC of the industrial hemp. So to me, it's just a non-starter that anybody would think that industrial hemp allows for increased recreational marijuana. And has that ever been brought up, I guess? All this stuff's been used. I mean, this is basic agronomy. So I guess
this is one of those cases, I think, of assertions on both sides, and I don't understand where exactly the governor is coming from. The other point that Les Meister makes is that by the time we approve this, particularly if it doesn't have an emergency clause on it, we can't do anything. Farmers wouldn't be able to do anything until the 1st of July, and that's too late to do anything this year anyway. So we really have another year to deal with this. But that's, and as far as the cost, there is an appropriation, I can't tell you where it is now, that would provide enough money for the Department of Agriculture to begin to set up the regulations, because before you can grow this stuff, you're going to have a license and training and da-da-da-da-da. And then the expectation is that the license fees and so forth will be enough to cover the costs of enforcement after that. So we have sort of a one-time appropriation, and I can't tell you how much it is, to get that going. And then the idea is that it's not going to cost the general fund anything once it's set up and running.
Representative Rasmussen, did you have another comment on that?
I would just encourage everyone to listen to Thursday's committee meeting. We're on hemp, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, yes. And if you have strong feelings one way or the other to send your thoughts to the senators before they vote.
We had a question over here.
This is David Elias from the Plain Talk. I guess I'm going to be picking on Nancy and Ray a little bit, but could you elaborate a little bit more on the announcements you made in your opening statements about how this is your last term? Could you talk a little bit about that and some of the decisions that went into that?
Did you hear that, Nancy?
Something, okay, this is from David Elias, and talk more about this being our last term.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll let you answer
Anything
first.
specific?
Just some, I guess, some general comments. Why did you make this decision to not run for re-election, I guess, when this term ends?
I was involved with the Turner County Republicans for many years, supporting people and asking other individuals to run to do this. And we had kind of run out of candidates, and my husband said, I think you would do a great job. And I have heard it said that those women who run for the House need more encouragement than men, and he gave me the right amount of encouragement. Our children were raised and out of the house, and so that is what helped me make the decision to run, and I have been real pleased that I did. And
To answer your question, they're both term limited.
Oh,
That's what.
I thought that was
that never even came
understood.
to mind. Well, since you're term limited, are you going to be doing what a lot of people do and switch houses?
Oh, well then I think you want to talk to Senator Rush. Because Senator Rush still has another term, if that's what you're wondering.
Well, maybe what I should ask is, are you deciding on your own to just step down, or do you plan to continue in the legislature, perhaps moving to the other house?
I would not move to the other house if Senator Rush is running. There isn't an open seat, and he does an excellent job. So I would not run again. My friend and excellent Senator Rush.
Yeah, I was going to say, I didn't really decide. The voters decided for me several years ago when they passed a constitutional amendment, but I wouldn't run anyway, I don't think. Actually, after I was elected the first time, I did a little counting ahead and decided that if I were fortunate enough to be reelected 3 more times, that would be it. I'll be 75. I've got grandchildren who are at that age where they'll be doing lots of sports and dance and God knows what all, and they all live a long way away, so we'll have to do a lot of traveling. And if I even had plans to try to run for the other house, do you think I'd announce it in front of Senator Rush right here? But I have no such plans. We seriously questioned whether I was going to run against it this time, and we did, but this is it.
You have 1 more year.
Oh, I have 1 more year, yeah, sure.
There's a question over here, and Representative Ring, I'll let you answer first because I know you're up against a time.
I'm sorry?
I'll let you answer this next question first because I know you're up against
all right.
time. But Jack?
Oh.
The Senate Bill 86 was passed by the Senate, goes to the House, and that's providing for calculations of sales tax revenue from sellers located outside the state. And there's the 0.5% that we added for education, but it's supposed to come back down as revenue comes in from out of state. Do you have any idea what's going to happen in the House?
I was hoping this one wouldn't come up. Let me give you a little background. When we passed the sales tax rate increase in 2016, apparently at the last minute, an amendment was brought called the Partridge Amendment that said, at that time, if we're ever able to collect online revenue, as the revenue goes, for every $20 million in additional revenue, we would reduce the sales tax rate by 0.1%, not to reduce it below 4%. Well, I just found out, listening to some testimony the other day, that that was sort of a sudden amendment made on the floor of the Senate. I think it was probably necessary to get enough votes, because if you remember, we just barely passed that rate increase. It wasn't written very well and needed to be changed. So we now have a Partridge Amendment to the Partridge Amendment that would basically do what I just said. I'm opposed to it. I think we should look at that additional revenue as a windfall. I mean, we've talked about all the different needs that we have for revenue here. I think to offset that is a mistake. There was an amendment earlier in the Senate that would have changed it so that for every $20 million that we got in, we would lower the sales tax rate on food by 1%, which would be even then, I think, better than revenue neutral. But if we're going to lower the rate, I'd rather lower the rate on food than lower the rate overall. As most of you know, I've been pushing for exempting food since day one. So on Wednesday night, I was asked about bringing a substitute amendment to the Partridge Amendment to exempt food, and because in the Senate that amendment died. And so I brought an amendment, and if you want to see some interesting discussion of it, go out to Corey Heidelberger's blog, whatever that is. But there's now a bill that will, then it got moved to it was in the Taxation Committee, then it got moved to the State Affairs, 7:45 Monday morning. It will be discussed in State Affairs. My amendment to the Partridge Amendment to the Partridge Amendment. I frankly expected at least my amendment to die there. Whether 86 will stay alive, I don't know. There's an alternative to 86 that came through the House that I think is even worse than 86. But there are some supporters of that. It passed the House. I'm hoping that we simply kill all of that and keep the revenue in the state. But there's a lot of argument that, well, we made a promise, we have to keep our promise, we make a promise every year of 3% or less for school aid, and we usually break it. But that's sort of where it stands.
Well, I've gotten dozens of emails from people saying, keep your promise, eliminate the extra half penny. Well, that isn't what was promised at all. You know, I thought the original Partridge Amendment, and my recollection is exactly what Ray said, that was done in order to get the last few votes that we needed in order to pass that. And what the Partridge Amendment said is, when you get to $20 million, then we're going to reduce it by 1/10 of 1%. And as far as I know, we haven't gotten to $20 million yet. And we won't know whether we've gotten to $20 million until July 1st of this coming year. And so, you know, the demands that I've been seeing from emails are totally divorced from what we actually promised at that time. You know, I guess if a majority feels, I think we need the revenue also. I'd hate to see us getting rid of this extra half penny and then not having enough money to provide for education or for the nursing homes that we've promised. I haven't really heard a lot of people who feel that that extra half penny of sales tax makes it impossible for them to buy things. South Dakota's got a history. You know, we repealed our inheritance tax 25 years ago with no replacement at all, and then we've wondered why we haven't had enough revenue to cover a lot of these things ever since then. So, you know, at the most that I would support a bill that absolutely, you know, when we get 20 million, we'll eliminate, when we get 40 million, we'll eliminate 2/10. When we get 30 million, or 60 million, we'll eliminate 3/10. But I don't think we're ever going to get that amount of money from the online sales tax either.
Can I make just one more comment following up on Art? You're right, we eliminated the inheritance tax and didn't do anything to replace it. If you go back a little farther than that, in 76 and 77, I think it was, they eliminated the personal property tax and supposedly broadened the sales tax base in order to pay for that. I've done some statistical analysis that suggests that there wasn't a significant increase in revenue as a result of that. And then in 95, we provided a lot more relief for the school on the school aid formula, and didn't really do anything to broaden that. So in my mind, that's three reasons that we're facing some real revenue shortages and a lack of resources. And I hate to cut out, but I do want to go to Berwin's funeral. So thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for your support. See you next year.
Representative Rasmussen, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I would. I would like to go back to the Partridge Amendment when it was offered on the floor to help pass the teacher increase. And I want everybody to know that I voted for the increase, and I was on board in the very beginning. It was not a vote that needed to be encouraged to go to the other side. I was always with the half penny sales tax. However, when Representative Partridge stood, had he not brought this amendment forward, I do not think it would have passed. And I think that when he spoke, and he's such a good speaker, that what he said and how the people in South Dakota heard what he was saying. I don't think anybody really heard the 1/10 of $20 million. They just heard, we're going to do this, and then we promise to give it back. Even if he would have had not did the if, when, then, and said and used the word promise, I think using these funds for something else, whether we did return it or didn't, would be different. I think there is from the people that I have heard from, it's a trust issue. It's not just a half penny. It has to do with trust, and it's education, and they've had promises before, and those promises are changed. And when we first started talking about the Partridge Amendment, we were told that one legislative body cannot hold another legislative body captive. And if that is true, then Representative Partridge should have never spoke that on the House floor. So I think in part it's a perception, and we're always going to need more money. And so I just think it'll be interesting to see, because there's two bills out there, a House one and a Senate one. So I guess that's all. We'll have to see what happens in committees.
And Nancy is absolutely right about the fact that no legislature can bind a future legislature, despite what they think. If we put this in the law, there's nothing that prevents a future legislature from changing that law.
Okay. Okay, we have time left for just one more question.
I can do the cliche. All right, would you please share with us your best bill of the session, or like the best experience of session, and the worst defeat you've had this session?
Well, I've got a couple of worst defeats. The one that I'm still shocked about is Senate Concurrent Resolution 6, and that's not the one that's most significant. My defeat of the death penalty is the most, for severely mentally ill is my worst, but Senate Concurrent Resolution 6, urging the President of the United States to make agricultural exports a priority and to protect agricultural products from all current and future tariffs. I wrote that. I used language directly out of the letter that Senator Thune and Senator Rounds and then Representative Noem sent to the President last fall. Didn't deviate at all from them. Overwhelming response. Favorable response in the Senate Agriculture Committee, passed unanimously on the Senate, killed unanimously by the House. It wasn't going to do anything, but I thought that at least it would tell our agricultural producers in South Dakota that we were supportive of them. My best result right now so far is my transparency bill. And again, this is the second year I brought that, which forbids the state government or any political entities from entering into a settlement agreement of a lawsuit that provides confidentiality, that they can't bring that out. Now, all of you, I'm sure, know about the Sanford Center up in Sioux Falls, where Sioux Falls announced that they had settled their claims against the contractors for $1 million because of the defective siding, and then the Argus Leader sued, and they ultimately had to release the settlement agreement, and it turned out that, yes, Sioux Falls got $1 million, but they paid the contractor $300,000 for this thing and $200,000 and $300,000 for the other things, so they really got nothing or next to nothing as a result of their settlement. And also, just at the time I filed this bill this year, the Brookings School Board announced that they had reached a settlement with a student who had sued them for not providing the appropriate education, and that they were announcing that they had settled this lawsuit, but they weren't going to tell anybody what they had settled it for because they had a confidentiality agreement in the settlement agreement. So the taxpayers in Brookings don't know whether they paid $100 or $100,000 because of their failure to provide that. So that's what this is aimed at. A year ago, the big opponents were the victims who might have been identified, so we put some language in there. The governor this year had announced that transparency was going to be a big part of her campaign, so I've worked with the governor's office, and we got some language that was agreeable to them. It's passed the Senate. Last year it passed the Senate by just 1 vote. I think this year we passed by 10 or 12 votes. It went to the House State Affairs and passed 8-4, I think, there, and we thought was going to be up on Thursday, but one of the people who wanted to speak for it was home ill that day, and so it's been delayed to Monday. I've been working every day, talking to as many legislators as I can to get their support for this bill. The State Newspaper Association is working to help me with that. The insurance industry is opposing it and is doing everything they can to torpedo it. Their concern is that lawsuits will be harder to settle, that if people's if the results of the lawsuit are going to be publicly announced. I don't particularly think that that's true. You know, if a lawyer is going to make a decision about, am I going to settle this even though it doesn't have a non-disclosure or confidentiality provision to it, or am I going to go to trial when the newspaper will be able to hear all the evidence every day? I still think that there's some incentive to settle it. You know, the big argument we hear is, well, this might be embarrassing to the people that are involved in this. And I say, well, you know, maybe the public ought to know about this embarrassing information. So that's kind of my rationale. You know, I'm still hoping that it gets somewhere. I'll talk about one last thing here, if you give me a time. Fake meat. How many of you know anything about fake meat? They're growing meat in the laboratories now with chemicals, and you know, I started reading about this, and so I went to some of my friends who are members of the stock growers, and they said, well, yeah, they're really concerned about fake meat, and the public not knowing what's really fake meat. And so I drafted a bill, and it's now got through the Senate. It's Senate Bill 68, merely requires that if it's not meat from a cow or turkey or poultry or pigs, that it has to be identified on the labeling so that people will know that it's really not what we would traditionally expect is meat. And so I've got great hopes that that will succeed. Why am I involved in fake meat when I'm not raising cattle? I guess I really not know, other than my friends in the stock growers wanted me to be the prime sponsor on that. So,
Representative Rasmussen.
Yes, well, thank you. I think that my successes and defeats are still yet to be determined. I am on new committees this year, Education and Judiciary. We had 35 House bills, and out of those 35 House bills, we have 2 bills signed, 5 that are left open. All the others have been defeated. With Senate bills, there were 23 Senate House bills. 1 has been signed, and 14 remain open. I've been somewhat disappointed in some of the bills that we passed, and so technically they should have gone to the floor, but instead of going to the floor, they were rerouted to appropriations or state affairs, so they could have been killed there. I think that if they would have gone to the floor and they would have been defeated, I would have felt better about that. We have a bill coming up on Monday, Senate Bill 188, which has to do mostly with testing of our students. I have large concerns about the type of testing and the data that is a part of that testing. So we'll see Monday how that bill goes. As far as judiciary is concerned, there is a bill. Well, there was a bill in the House and one in the Senate, but I'm just going to mention the House Bill 1195. That bill was asking to open up just a small piece of the Juvenile Justice Code from Senate Bill 73. We've had teachers and parents and policemen ask for the legislator's help since that was passed, because in the last 4 years, stakeholders have not felt that they have been receiving the kind of help everybody was encouraged to believe that 73 was going to do. So that bill I would encourage people to listen to if you're interested in. 1195, again, the proponents and opponents are so opposite in what their presentation is. It sometimes was confusing to me to believe that it was even the same bill that they were talking about. So I think those are the 2 bills that are still up, and I will wait to see how those are handled.
Okay, well, that is our time for today. I want to thank our sponsors, the VCDC, the League of Women Voters, Clay County Democrats, Clay County Republicans, thank all of our legislators for coming out today, and most importantly, thank all of you for your engagement and for coming out on this chilly morning. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Thank you.